Remember, one of the things I started doing early on, because I understood it quite well, was to publicly criticise the PCR or polymerase chain reaction test, because I knew enough about it. I'm not a molecular biology expert, but I've hired people who are, and I understand how PCR works, this idea of developing primers, bait as it were, for the thing you're trying to detect, and then to amplify it repeatedly, potentially up to 1 trillion-fold. People will be pretty familiar, I think, with the idea of DNA testing that would be used for forensic purposes. And I point out to them that the PCR test uses most of the same technology. And imagine if you were preparing for a trial and you were able, with your attorney, to show the judge the conditions under which PCR testing was being done. Relatively inexperienced lab staff doing hundreds of thousands of pipetting actions a day in the same laboratory, and you said, look, Your Honour, my client's sample is one of those on the bench there. There might be cross-contamination. In fact, I suspect it's inevitable, but you'll get the result shortly. I mean, the judge would just throw the entire evidence set out of court, and rightly so. But it's the same technology that's being used to work out whether your sample or that of a family member or someone in your community is or is not positive for this virus. It's completely fraudulent the way it's being done. You simply cannot run a technique like that at industrial scale and expect the results to be meaningful, and they're not. I don't think they've ever been meaningful. One of the frauds our government and the people they hired to run the testing have done is they refused to entertain the idea that there is something called a false positive rate. I assure you, if you run any diagnostic test repeatedly, sometimes there'll be a positive result when there's nothing in the sample. That's called a false positive. False negatives also occur, but let's focus on false positives. We don't really know whether that's going to occur 0.5% of the time, 4% of the time. This is enormously material to telling you whether there's lots of infection in your community or pretty much none at all. But you will find nowhere in the world has anyone measured and released often this what's called operational false positive rate. You should disregard all announcements about case rates in your community because they're completely fraudulent. You cannot run a medical diagnostic test without those checks being run in situ every time